Good morning. I'm Charles Chrestman. I want to welcome you to this Memorial Day weekend lesson entitled Accepting. I hope you and yours are doing well. As we start today's lesson, I encourage you to have a Bible handy or your Explore the Bible study guide so you can follow along as we're reading the focal passages. The final section of Paul's letter to the church in Rome focuses on two important points. The first part, chapter 14, addresses the relationships among believers. The second part, chapter 15, describes how Christian living involves pleasing others. Paul opened this section of his letter with an appeal for believers to accept one another, especially those who were weaker in the faith. The problem Paul was addressing involved behavior that in itself was not good or bad. However, the way believers were reacting to the behavior was creating disharmony in the church. Now, two problems in particular seemed to be at issue. The first was differing dietary habits between the Jews and the Gentile Christians, and the second seemed to be the special status given to certain days. Now, the people who disagreed on these topics were relating to each other with judgment and disdain, and as you can imagine, this was creating rifts in the church. Paul offered two reasons why this behavior was unacceptable. First, as servants of God, believers are responsible to God alone. Servants do not judge servants, masters judge servants. Second, a believer who judged another believer was usurping God's authority as some kind of righteous judge. And rather than judging a brother and sister, Paul was of the opinion believers should not place stumbling blocks before Christians. Now, as we get to today's lesson, I want you to notice how Paul addresses the problem, the questions he asked his audience, the arguments he made, the statements intended to lead his audience to unity. Also, notice who Paul assigns the primary responsibility to for solving the problem. Notice his encouragement was to build people up, people's faith, people's knowledge, people's understanding of life, and so forth. What Paul was really addressing is what we would call today risk aversion. This is where someone makes a mistake, we see it immediately, it's magnified, and in many instances placed on social media. This is not something Paul would condone. As a result, the person of focus becomes a little bit more careful, more cautious, and more suspicious when things like this happen. And directly or indirectly, such behavior contributes to a cycle of mistrust and suspicion. Paul would tell us we need to avoid this, that we have an obligation as a Christian to help those weaker in the faith and offer those people encouragement and positive feedback so they can grow in their faith, confidence, and accountability, especially to God. Paul's first admonition to the early Christians was simply to stop judging. That gets us to our first focal passage today, taken from Romans 14, verses 1 through 4. Follow along with me if you would like. Reading, accept anyone who is weak in the faith, but don't argue about disputed matters. One person believes he may eat anything, while one who is weak eats only vegetables. One who eats must not look down on one who does not eat, and one who does not eat must not judge one who does, because God has accepted him. Who are you to judge another's household servant? Before his own Lord he stands or he falls, and he will stand because the Lord is able to make him stand. Very interesting how Paul wrote that. In these verses, we actually see that Paul dealt with specifically two groups within the church at Rome. First were the weak, and the second were the strong. He did not identify the two groups beyond listing the three activities that were causing issues: eating meat, honoring special days, and drinking wine. Jesus taught that all foods were clean and could be eaten. You can find the reference there in Mark to where Jesus made this statement. Therefore, some believers rightly understood they were free to eat all kinds of foods. However, some believers did not feel the same freedom. In verse 4, Paul asked a rhetorical question to reinforce his admonition that believers should not judge fellow believers. He asked, "Who are you to judge another's household?" So, what point was Paul making with this question? We have a responsibility to accept other believers as God has accepted them and to refrain from judging. So, how can we personally improve using Paul's teaching? Well, we can start by increasing what is called our emotional intelligence. Help people break the cycle of suspicion and distrust of others. In other words, we can take the risk to care. Everyone has an emotional bank account. We can make deposits in those emotional bank accounts. You might ask, well, how do I do this? You say, John or Mary, it's really nice to see you this morning. Or, Pastor, you did a great job with the sermon today. Perhaps, John or Mary, I hope you have a productive week this week. Finally, Jack, that was a really good idea. You can see how all of these statements would be deposits in the emotional bank account of a person. Researcher Annabelle Jensen tells us that it only takes 6 seconds for someone to know you care when they first meet you. Isn't that incredible? The Apostle Paul knew matters of false doctrine and unchristian behavior needed to be corrected in his day. In matters of religious practices, people needed to show grace and acceptance, not judgment and disdain. Do you know of issues in the church today that stir debate that are similar to the issues Paul addressed in verses 1 through 4? Paul's second example of differences among the Roman believers related to the observance of special days. Paul did not identify which days were considered special or why. He actually simply wrote what we see in verses 5 through 8 of Romans 14. Reading, one person judges one day to be more important than another day. Someone else judges every day to be the same. Let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. Whoever observes the day observes it for the honor of the Lord. Whoever eats, eats for the Lord, since he gives thanks to the Lord. And whoever does not eat, it is for the Lord that he does not eat, and he gives thanks to God. For none of us lives for himself, no one dies for himself. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Now, some scholars have suggested Paul was referring to Gentile Christians in these verses who still paid attention to Roman lucky and unlucky days or to special days related to pagan feasts. More likely, Paul was referring to Jewish feast days, possibly including the observance of the Sabbath or special days of fasting. Regardless of his intent, the same reactions of judgment and disdain seem to be at play here. Paul did not commend one position or the other. He simply said, let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. Paul ended his thoughts on this topic strongly. He said, therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. In other words, Paul was saying we belong to God because he bought us. So what did Paul teach us in these verses? Our goal in life should be to honor the Lord. And folks, in a world of distributed workforces and relationships that are curated by social media, it is increasingly difficult to connect and really know someone. Be deliberate in your intentions. The rule has got to be no guessing. Let's read our third focal passage for today that deals with removing obstacles. Reading, Christ died and returned to life for this, that he might be Lord over both the dead and the living. But you, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or you, why do you despise your brother or sister? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow to me, and every tongue will give praise to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Paul had a very creative way of expressing truth to his audiences. In these verses, he reminded his fellow Christians that one thing they shared was infinitely more significant than any differences that might have separated them. Researcher Annabelle Jensen once said, We cannot be non judgmental. Our brains are wired to continuously make judgments. So, what can we do? We can notice the assumptions we're making and stay curious. Our brains have an innate tendency to make assumptions, so why not start with positive assumptions? I think the Apostle Paul would tell us to remove all the useless obstacles we find in our way and work on our integrity. Perhaps he would tell us we need to strengthen our emotional intelligence muscles. Harmonious relationships are important. I think we see that from Paul's lesson today and how important it is to accept and encourage other believers. And there are three things that come to mind when we think about this. The first is caring. The second is to be intentional in our relationships with that person. And the third thing is our integrity. If people care about each other, if they trust each other, and if intentions are clear, then the ability to collaborate goes up. The ability to create goes up. The ability to create high performance individuals and teams go up. An organization's ability to attract people, retain people, engage people goes up when it cares, when its intentions are clear, when it acts with integrity. Perhaps this was what Paul was wanting the church in Rome to understand and embrace. Folks, I want to thank you for joining us for today's lesson. It was a good one. Some solid content in it there as we wind down our study in the book of Romans from the Apostle Paul. Next Sunday, we wrap up the book of Romans with our final study that's entitled Reach. I hope you will join us. God bless you. Have a great week.